Hello and welcome to another edition of Sri's Sunday New York Times Read Along. Our guest is Ken Tingley, retired editor of the Post-Star from Glens Falls, New York. My name is Neil Parekh. I'm the executive producer and guest host of the show, and I'll be in the chair today. We're live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Digimentors website. We're also live on Ken's Twitter account and count them, two of Ken's Facebook pages. I think one is more personal and one is a little bit more professional. But we welcome everyone watching, regardless of where you're watching from, what channel you're watching on. Please let us know where you're watching. Put a comment in on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn, and we'd be able to show it on the screen. Please like, comment, share, tag a friend. Let them know that we're going to have a great discussion today with Ken Tingley, retired editor of the Post-Star in Glens Falls, New York, and author of two books that we'll be getting to in just a moment. But before we start, I want to give you a little preview of today's show, and we will do that in just a moment. What we want to make sure that folks know that we have some really great content on our website as well. We put a blog post every week for the show, and it helps people in terms of figuring out links to additional content, links to his books. We have links to articles that we might be reading. So I certainly encourage you to check that out. If you go to our Digimentors website, digimentors.group, and click on Insights, you'll get to the blog post. And again, we're really thrilled to have Ken join us today. It's going to be a focus on local journalism, which is something that we're always interested in. We focus on the New York Times, but we also like to talk about local newspapers and the importance of local journalism. So we encourage you to subscribe to whatever paper may be in your area. Now for that preview of today's show. This week on Sri's Sunday New York Times Read Along, our guest is Ken Tingley, a retired editor of the Post-Star in Glens Falls, New York. Neil Parekh will be the guest host. Ken was editor of the Post-Star for 21 years. He is the author of two books, The Last American Editor, Chronicling Life, Death, Triumph, and Tragedy in a Small Town in 2021, with a foreword by Margaret Sullivan, and The Last American Newspaper, an institution in peril through the eyes of a small-town editor, published at the end of August. In addition to his books, Ken has a Substack newsletter, The Front Page, Upstate New York, chronicling his observations about Glens Falls, Lake George, and Saratoga Springs. The focus of his most recent newsletter is The Quiet Epidemic, a documentary about Lyme disease that is playing at film festivals around the country. Ken will also talk about the rise of Representative Elise Stefanik. She was a moderate Republican when she first ran for office, and Ken was editor of the Post-Star. She's now a staunch supporter of Donald Trump. As a bonus, we'll also ask Ken about his thoughts on Aaron Judge's historic season. Sri Srinivasan is our host. I am the executive producer and occasional guest host, Neil Parekh. Paula Kiger helps produce the show, engaging with the audience on Facebook and LinkedIn. Sri has been hosting the New York Times Read Along for almost 7 years, with some amazing guests. The show is produced by Digimentors. We produce high-quality virtual and hybrid events for organizations big and small around the world. We also do social and digital consulting, training, and workshops. Again, Ken Tingley is our guest, live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Digimentors website. There we go. That's the overview of today's show. And again, I am thrilled to be the guest host. It's always an honor and a pleasure to sit in the big chair. And I've always mentioned that to Sri from the very first day that he gave me his Facebook password. Can you imagine someone like Sri giving out his Facebook password? But he trusted me with the show, and I am forever grateful. Let's take a look at, say hi to some of the folks watching on various channels. We have Diane Stefani watching on LinkedIn from Margate, New Jersey, and watching on Facebook as well. She might be switching back and forth. Thank you, Diane, for all of your support. Patricia Freudenberg is watching on LinkedIn, saying hi to the New York Times Read Along team. Thank you, Patricia. Nikhil is saying good morning as well from LinkedIn, on LinkedIn rather. And Miriam Berkeley is watching from Hell's Kitchen. Hi, Miriam. Doug Levy is up early in California, as always. Thank you, Doug. And hi, Mom. Or should I say, hi, Mom, somewhere over there? My mom's visiting for a couple days, so she's actually in Springfield, Virginia. She's in the living room watching, and it's been really great to have her here. It's been great to have see her with my daughter Emily. It's been really great. So, Mom, thank you for coming down, and thank you for being a loyal watcher. I know you watch the show from wherever you are, whether you're at home in New York or whether you're you know she's watched the show after landing at the airport at 8:30 a.m. from India, and she fired it up on her phone. So thank you, Mom, and I'll see you after the show. Ken Fisher is watching from Iowa. Ken, thank you so much. Linda Lawrence is saying good morning from a cool and very windy Long Island. Thank you, Linda. And our producer, Paula Kiger, is watching from Tallahassee, Florida. And she says our local paper is the Tallahassee Democrat and is excited that we're honoring, celebrating local journalism. Thank you, Paula, for everything that you do. Uh, we want to make sure that you know, in addition to Paula, the show is sponsored by Muckrack. Thank you to Muckrack for all of your support for the show, a longtime sponsor of Sri's Sunday New York Times Read Along. And the show is produced by our team at Digimentors. Digimentors, we produce high quality virtual and hybrid events. We also do social and digital consulting workshops. We even organized an online election for an organization. If you're interested in having us work with you, please send us an email. You can reach us at sri@digimentors.group or neil@digimentors.group. And we'd love to work with you on an event. So, with that, what I want to do is to take a quick look at the paper to get a sense of what's on the front pages. I'll just say hi to Liz real quick from the Berkshires before we do that. Hey, Liz. And then after that, we'll bring on our guest, Ken Tingley. So, let's go to the newspaper. The front page this week focuses the lead is Russian troops retreat from crucial rail hub as Ukrainians push on. And there are two stories here. Nuclear talk revives tone of Cold War, and Putin claimed area the day before where they retreated from. The display story on the left is also a Ukraine story. A member of the Ukrainian military stood by Saturday as a fellow soldier was treated at a field hospital. Um, the big story, of course, out of Florida is Hurricane Ian. And our hearts go out to everyone who was affected by Ian. We're still trying to determine the death toll. Um, the you know, in particular, this story focuses, I believe it was Lee County that delayed their evacuation order and had an impact on a huge impact on survivors, people who were able to survive. Um, Below the fold, there's a article about Herschel Walker, who is running for the Senate in Georgia. Lawmakers fearing the worst as intimidation tactics grow. And then you can't quite see the headline, it's right over the fold. Venezuela sets U.S. prisoners free in swap. And there was also prisoners who were freed from Iran as well. So that's what we have on the front page. The opinion section is about the Supreme Court, at least the front page The cover, the Supreme Court is broken. Where's Biden? Uh, a president has the power to shape the public's view of the bench and its high stakes rulings. Now's the time. So you can see actually the image, and I'll unfold this for you. You have President Biden, the image of him at least, hiding behind one of the pillars of the Supreme Court. So we'll take a look at that. We have a special section this week on travel. There's the cover, and the headline is way at the bottom: Asia beckons again. Places to visit, foods to sample, and more as the region welcomes back travelers, which is really interesting in terms of the Times. You can really track the pandemic with the Times' travel coverage. They don't have a standalone travel section anymore, but every now and then they do special sections around travel. We had the Amy Vership, the editor of the travel section, as our guest Memorial Day weekend. They did a special issue on cycling. So we'll want to check that out. If you've traveled in Asia extensively, let us know. The Sunday business section, my ride. Here's the image, and then the headline: my ride in our driverless future. It was spooky, impressive, and a little stressful. That was before the car got stuck. Driverless cars. What's your thought on driverless cars? Would you get in one? I have not gotten in one. I'm not sure I'm ready for that just yet. There's also an important article here that is very disturbing: how McKinsey got into the business of addiction. We know about McKinsey's role in various scandals, but specifically this one I'd not heard of. The consulting firm worked for decades with big tobacco and then helped Juul. So that is something to pay attention to. Arts and leisure. Again, the image, it's a full page cover. You can see the top half, but you can't quite see the text. You can only see David Geffen above the fold. And I'll just move it up a little bit. You can just see the text in the bottom left corner. Flipping it over, David Geffen, it's David Geffen Hall. So not even David Geffen. The home of the New York Philharmonic is reborn again after a $550 million renovation aimed at breaking its acoustic curse. And we'll see whether that worked or not. So that's arts and leisure. And Sunday styles, Givenchy on the line. And then the full, you open it up, the bottom half of the page. Matthew Williams has a modern vision for the brand that once dressed Audrey Hepburn. Can he make others see it? That's Sunday styles. Book review, Lost for Words in Our Missing Hearts. Celeste Ng imagines a world where free speech is under attack. So that's by Stephen King. Interesting. I don't recall Stephen King writing book reviews, so we'll have to take a look at that. New York Times Magazine the cover is Whoopi Goldberg, Miss Big Mouth. No matter how often she gets into trouble, Whoopi Goldberg refuses to shut up. And I can see there's a little bit of glare on that cover, so I'll move it down just a little bit so you can see that. And this week's issue has the T Magazine, a celebration of the country where design was born, the Italian way. So that's a nice thick magazine that comes out. I believe it's the October issue. I think it's monthly, not certain. But that's the overview of what we can expect in the paper today. We'll get to that in just a moment. But first, we want to remind you that our guest is Ken Tingley, retired editor of the Post-Star in Glens Falls, New York, and the author of 2 books that we'll be hearing about in just a moment. So with that, I'm going to bring on Ken Tingley. Ken, welcome.
Good morning. Good morning, Neil.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. We always start our show. This has been 2.5 years now with the pandemic. We always ask our guests what the last 2.5 years have been like for you, personally and professionally. I know that we're going to be talking about books that you've written, which based on the publication dates of 2021, 2022, seems like these were pandemic projects. But in general, how did the pandemic treat you and your loved ones?
I guess living in a place like Glens Falls, New York, which, for your viewers, we're as close to Montreal as we are to New York City. So it gives you a little idea. We're north of Albany, right near beautiful Lake George and Saratoga Springs. So it's a great place to live in that regard. Now, I retired kind of right at the dawning of the pandemic it was July 2020. So we were right in the middle of it, and this provided me the opportunity I was looking for something, obviously, to transition, and it allowed me to jump into the writing of both books simultaneously, I might add. The first book was a collection of my columns from my 30 years writing for the Post-Star, while the second book is more of a memoir of all the great work that was done at my newspaper over the past 20 years. So for me personally, and I think my wife and I both, we enjoyed just kind of being at home. So it didn't have a profound effect upon us in that regard. I mean, our son came home for a while. He was in grad school, and we got to spend a little bit more time with him, which was really kind of a bonus for us as well. Sometimes spent evenings playing Scrabble, Trivial Pursuit, things like
Sure,
that.
sure. Now we all saw our lives upended a bit in terms of what kinds of activities we could do and who we were spending time with. But certainly the fact that you were able to write two books simultaneously, I didn't know that these were simultaneous. I thought you just did pumped out one after the other.
Yeah.
So we will talk about that in just a moment. Want to give a quick hello to Pradnya Haldapur, who's watching. I know she's watching or she's from Silver Spring, Maryland. I don't want to assume that she's there because we always have people surprising us with where they log in from. But Pradnya, thank you so much for joining. And our good friend Stephen Kaplan is watching, saying good morning to our New York Times read along family. Um, and he says that we all must support local journalism. And our friend Carla Baranakis comes to mind, of course, with the local connection. And we'll talk about the local connection in later in the show. Um, the starting talking about the book, Ken, you mentioned it right off the bat. Your first book was The Last American Editor, and Mark Mahoney, who is was a Pulitzer Prize winning editorial page editor at the Gazette in Schenectady, said in part, Ken Tingley was more than a columnist for their newspaper, talking about the Post-Star. He was their conscience, their advocate, their friend. You must owe him big time. That's high
Well,
praise.
Mark was also the editorial page editor for us at the Post-Star.
Oh yeah,
Mark won the Pulitzer Prize in 2009 for editorial page writing. We worked very closely together for years on issues of importance in our community. And he's kind of one of those guys that provides the beating heart of a local newspaper.
so that's the front page when you won the Pulitzer, and that's I guess Mark then right in the middle.
That is Mark being a little bit amazed that, I explained to many people at the time that, in places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, other big newspapers, they know when it's Pulitzer Day. They know that it's going on. They're kind of on the edge of their seat, seeing what's going to happen. No one in our newsroom, with the exception of myself, probably knew that the Pulitzers were even being announced that day. So when our publisher, Rick Emanuel at the time, called for all hands on deck meeting in the conference room at the Post-Star, everyone was more worried that there were more layoffs being announced.
Sure.
And instead, happened to be on vacation in Florida, as it turned out. Instead, they put me on the speakerphone, and I announced that Mark had won the Pulitzer Prize for editorial writing.
Wow.
Over a couple other really big newspapers. I think one might have been the Washington Post.
That must have been incredible. Absolutely
It
incredible
was.
for a small newspaper, local newspaper.
Not,
Um,
not many small papers win it. Although more in editorial writing than in other parts of it. But yeah, that was one of those things that will stick with you forever.
Sure, sure. So take a moment. We want to spend most of our time on your second book, but tell us about the Last American Editor. Um,
Sure. When I retired, I had been writing columns for a long time, and I really took a lot of pride in my column writing. And I started putting together a collection of stories about people in my community, their stories. And so often that was what I was writing about. It wasn't the politics as much in things like that. It was about the woman who had MS, about the basketball player whose mother died of breast cancer the day of the big sectional championship game.
wow.
And as I started putting together the columns, I was really struck by how so many of these stories still held up even 5, 10, 15 years later. Margaret Sullivan, who was the media columnist for the Washington Post, she wrote in the foreword that when us in the newspaper business, we're often writing in the moment, and we're only concerned with the moment. And she said, but these were columns, and these was a collection that kind of transcended the moment and was of, you know, just would last over time. They were kind of a history of our community. And one of the things that I found as I put the columns together, not only did they kind of hold up as just great people stories of people's lives and the challenges they faced, they also I started looking at them and saying I wanted to know what happened to these people after I did the column. Some of
Mm,
them, like I said, were 5, 10 years older. So I added a PS thing, and I started trying to find people and find out what happened to them, how their lives turned out. I mentioned the one column I did on a woman named Erica Perkins who had MS. She was this 25-year-old woman with MS with a 10-year-old daughter, and she was in really tough straits when I interviewed her. And so I looked 10 years later, I tried to find her and I couldn't find her anywhere. But, those of us in the newspaper game, we tend to be a little bit tenacious. I looked for her on Facebook and Twitter, couldn't find her. And finally, I remembered her daughter had an interesting name named Desiree. Well, I found Desiree had a Facebook account in Queensbury, which is the town where we're from. And I sent a message to her and assured her I was not a stalker or anything. She was like an 18-year-old in high school. I found her. She had made the honor roll at the high school. And I said, I'm trying to contact your mother. What's happened to her? She said, well, you couldn't contact her because she had remarried, had 2 more children, and was doing much better in recouping from the MS.
mm.
One of my first book signings with the Last American Editor, Erica actually showed up at the book signing. We had a little bit of a reunion. We hadn't seen each other in over 10 years. And it was great. She still was suffering a little bit from its effects, but she was doing much better. And it was awesome to see that kind of have that kind of connection again.
So I want to take a moment and share, the value just in terms of what we bring to a show like this. Paula Kiger, who is producing on, connecting with the audience on Sri's Facebook and LinkedIn channels, and we can always follow up with folks afterward on your Facebook channels as well. Did a little research and found the Mark's Pulitzer Prize page, and in fact, he did beat out a Post reporter and 3 from the Chicago Tribune.
Review. Yeah.
So kudos to Mark. And she also put a link in Facebook to your post following up on Erica in your Substack newsletter. So that's one thing we want to make sure folks know about that. I guess after you do start it after you retired, the Substack. So this is
Yes.
Ken's
Same
Substack page.
thing. I
Yep,
started working on.
we're having some
Yes.
audio issues, Ken, with Ken's connection. Ken, can you hear me?
How am I now? Yes, I can.
It's coming in and out a little bit. We can hear you now. So you started a Substack as well.
Okay. That's correct. Yes. I still had that urge to write, even with that. So even while writing the two books, I started dabbling in the Substack platform and started writing 3 columns a week. At first, I was writing 7 columns a week and then cut it back to 3 on local opinion stuff, on what I'm seeing in the community, on pretty much the same type of columns that I wrote when I was at the Post-Star. So, and I've gotten a pretty good, feedback on that. And, what I've found over the last year too is that it's filling kind of the void because the local newspaper that I work for isn't having as many. They don't have the columnists that they used to have. They don't have the opinion or the editorials that we used to. And it's one of the things that we've lost, most recently.
And you can find Ken's Substack, kentingley.substack.com, kentingley.substack.com. We want to we want to talk a little bit more about your second book that, again, you started working on right away. This is The Last American Newspaper. You worked on it at the same time. How, how do you actually do that? How do you, I mean, righty lefty? Are you ambidextrous?
Well, because the first book was a collection of my columns. It was really about choosing the columns, putting them back together, and then working on the PS item. So it wasn't as hard. So pretty much while I was putting that together, I was doing the research. What the last American newspaper is not really a reference to my newspaper in Glens Falls. It's kind of a metaphor for all the small community newspapers across the country and what they're going through, right now and in probably over the previous 15 years. And what I've tried to do is by chronicling the great stories in journalism that we did over the last 21 years is to show the value of what a difference we made in our community. And I think what so many other newspapers make in their communities as well. So I went back and really year by year, I'm one of these meticulous record keepers and kept all old clips and boxes of newspapers. And I started reading everything over again. And again, I was struck by, wow, not so much that I had done great work, but the people, the reporters and editors who worked at the Post-Star over those years had done amazing work and had changed things in our community. And that was something that really struck me as, like I said, I'm sure there are so many other newspapers who are the same way, who also made a difference. And I think people in our communities are forgetting that. They forget that journalism. We've always been criticized in newspapers for what we didn't do, for the mistake we made, maybe for a position we took in an editorial. But when you come back and you read, I think in this book, all the different stories that we did address, I think will remind people of, wow, yeah, that's what we need today.
Before we jump into the book, I want to just give a shout out to Ellen Austin, who's saying hi from Penn Station. So I'm guessing she might be on her way out of town. Thank you, Ellen, for joining us. Ron Thomas, a previous guest on the show, is watching from Dubai. Thank you, Ron. And Jay Palaki is watching from LinkedIn. I took a peek at our LinkedIn page since their name and picture didn't come through. But Jay, thank you so much for watching from Maryland today. Always great to have you. So as far as the book is concerned, let's talk a little bit about what you covered, starting with your local representative from Glens Falls, Representative Elise Stefanik. She started off as a moderate and evolved, or actually, in my mind, maybe devolved into a staunch Trump supporter. I make no apologies about my political orientation and leanings, but she went full MAGA. Can you tell us about her evolution and some of these pictures that you have in the book?
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting story. Elise Stefanik kind of came on the scene in 2014 when our district had an opening for congressional representative. And she was this fresh-faced Harvard graduate, had worked in the Bush administration, had been a debate prep person for Paul Ryan when he was on the vice president ticket later on, and she, came running. She was running in our district to replace what we had a Democrat previously. Our district had kind of been. It's a very it's changed over the years. Boundaries keep changing, but it has been a very known, particularly as a Republican district. Yet oddly enough, we've had Democrats like Kirsten Gillibrand
Mm-hmm.
represent us up here, who Senator Gillibrand at the time was very pro-gun, which you don't see now. So it shows you what politicians have to do to get elected. So it was kind of a purple district at the time, because we had a Democrat. So when she was running, one of our first editorial meetings, and it was Will Doolittle, one of our editors at the Post-Star, and I were in a meeting with her. And I always remember we asked her, what her position was on climate change. And she said, well, I'm not a scientist. And we were like kind of stunned, and as this is a response, because this is one of the Republican talking points that we were hearing quite regularly. And Will turned to her and said, my goodness, you graduated from Harvard. Shouldn't you have a better answer than that? But, over the years, she did start to change. And by the time 2016 came around and Trump was running, she actually would not say his name in public. She did not go to the Republican convention that year. She again took this kind of stuck out this moderate position. And I can remember in one editorial board before our endorsement, I asked her, I had a little graph, conservative on the right and liberal on the left, and said, where are you on the spectrum? And she put an X right to just the right of the middle, and that certainly has changed quite a bit. So beginning in about in the summer of 2019, Glens Falls became kind of an upstate ground zero for protests. And we have a little roundabout downtown. And here's an example, a picture I took from one of the first protests in June 2019. And a group of liberal Democrats were protesting Trump. And, there was a small group of Trump Republicans there, 5 or 6 of them. And it was kind of ugly. And this one woman was screaming at this one Trump supporter, and they were going back and forth. Neither was listening to the other. Wasn't getting a lot done. But it was kind of scary. And I remember writing a column at the time that said, this is Glens Falls, New York. We're known as hometown USA. And if this can happen here, then this can happen anywhere, this type of divisiveness. Well, these protests continued over the year. The pro-Trump group continued to build in numbers, and to the point where, and it just each rally became more and more ugly. They had to separate the liberal Democrats had to meet in one place and the Trump people on the other place. And when they would walk to Stefanik's office to protest, there would be a lot of expletives. They'd be waving Trump flags at one point, and this is kind of fortuitous. Just the one point, they complained to the city that said the Trump flag should be outlawed because they could be used as weapons. Well, knowing what we know about January 6th, that actually proved to be quite true.
Can you tell us what's going on in this picture?
Yeah, later on at one of the rallies, our reporter at the time had tried to interview several of the Trump people, and this one man with the bullhorn was screaming at her that she was fake news, that you couldn't believe anything she said. And he took a toy, this orange toy, ridiculous looking gun, and pointed at you. And he started screaming over the bullhorn, "Post-Star, we've got one coming for you."
Wow.
That was kind of chilling for me as the editor at the time. And unfortunately, it gets worse. A couple days later, the and this is the middle of all this that's going on. A representative from Representative Stefanik's office invited this man to come to her town hall meeting in the neighboring town, to bring all his friends to fill all the seats in the front row, and that they were going so that they could show the support for Elise Stefanik. I wrote her when I heard about this. I wrote her communications director, and I said, "I'm shocked by this, that Elise Stefanik is supporting someone who has threatened not only a reporter and editors on a staff, but my entire newspaper." This was not that long after the Capitol Gazette shooting, and
Sure.
you took these things very seriously. And I said to her, I would ask her to immediately denounce this man and what he has said. And I would ask her to, since she was coming to a neighboring town, to stop by our newspaper, to talk to the other employees at my newspaper. It doesn't have to be the reporters and editors. She has a beef with us, that's fine. But to talk to the other people, the people who sell classified ads, the people in the business office, the advertising folks, the delivery folks, and explain to them why they had put her in danger, why
Sure.
they put them in danger.
Sure.
So yeah, that was a very kind of low point as far as I was concerned in local politics.
So before we go on with other stories from the book, we do have a comment from YouTube. John Casserly is asking, and this I think is the follow up to your setup of the book, and what happens to with local coverage. Uh, on my assumption of the premise is that when a small town newspaper contracts and or closes, who goes to the town or village board meeting and reports on to the public on what went on? um, what happens, to that idea of sunshine in a democracy, understanding what's going on, who's going to be our eyes and ears.
It's a great point, and incidentally, Mark Mahoney won the Pulitzer for editorials on freedom of information.
Mm,
We had a strong. The one thing to remember about newspapers like the Post-Star and so many other community newspapers, we weren't just Glens Falls newspaper. We were a newspaper for so many, over 3 counties. We covered probably 35 to 40 school districts, 35 to 40 towns, villages. So we were the kind of the town square for all these places. And so at one point, we had as many as 45 reporters and editors working in our newsroom. And now it's under 10. And what happens then is, and what was happening when I was editor, each time you'd lost a couple reporters here and there, you contracted. You couldn't cover the town on the outline out, and everything kept getting closer and closer, smaller to Glens Falls. And absolutely right that you end up with those places are not being covered anymore.
mm,
And they've already done research and showed when newspapers that have gone out of business and newspapers that have reduced that type of coverage, fewer people vote. Fewer people want to go to the polls because they don't know who's running and what they stand for. You see more corruption. You see actually taxes go up because politicians are kind of left to spend money unfettered without that kind of discussion that would go on, regarding school budgets or regular budgets of any kind.
and that sunshine quote, sunshine being the great disinfectant in a democracy. I want to go back to some of the images from the book, and what I want to do, Ken, is actually show a series of images and then
Sure.
discuss them as a whole. We have this front page after a boat capsized in Lake George, 20 dead, and that's a zoomed in of just the photo of that officer. taking a moment.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
you have the
just to,
lifeguard. I just want to go through. I want to go
sure,
through all three and then
sure,
come back real quick.
okay.
You have the Coast Guard pulling up a life jacket. You have a funeral procession. I believe this was from a fire. Um, you have another funeral. You have, I think this was alcohol poisoning for, I
It was
think it
actually a
was a high
car crash.
school. Oh, is this a car crash rather?
Yeah.
Um, and then before we go to these women, but these three pictures in general, uh, when you have tragedies in a local community, can you talk about the role that a local newspaper plays in covering a tragedy? We've seen this, at the national level with mass shootings, Uvalde, Texas, for example, or in Buffalo. But can you talk about what role a paper like the Post-Star plays when there's an incident, any of these types of incidents or others in a community?
Yeah, since I certainly, since you have the one photo up, let me talk a little bit about that. This was a terrible story where 20 senior citizens on a tour from the Detroit area died when a small tour boat on Lake George capsized. This story went around the world. This, the picture is especially compelling, and one that we had a discussion about in our newsroom. But it was taken by a young man named T.J. Hooker, who was in his 20s at the time. He was finishing up his shift at the newsroom when he heard a scanner call about a boat overturned in Lake George, and he heard that there was 5 or 6 people in the water, and he said, "Wow, that seemed like a lot." And then he heard there was more than that in the water. He immediately went out to the newsroom. We had one reporter working in the newsroom. It was a Sunday afternoon. He said, "Amanda, come with me." They went up to Lake George. It's about a 20 minute drive if you're driving very fast. He was driving very fast. He followed the ambulances there. He immediately rushed down to as close to the lake as he could get. He turned the corner, and this was the scene that he saw of this sheriff bending down. There's bodies covered in the front. There were 7 or 8 bodies. He took a step back. He clicked off 2 shots before someone told him that he had to leave that area. And this was important. He was one of the first of the news media on the scene. And this captured, we believed, we talked about it, you're not supposed to put dead bodies on the front page. But we felt like, how could you not tell this story of catastrophic death without this photo and without showing, the effect it had on first responders like this officer. And you may even notice the headline underneath. The reporter that went with her, one of the first quotes she got was from an elderly woman in her 70s, and the first thing she said was, I don't know where my husband is. And her husband had died. This was a story that started on that day, and we continued to cover over the next 20 years. As you can imagine, there was lawsuits. It turned out that the boat tour operator had been sold fake insurance. It just, the story went
Wow.
off in multiple ways. So never, a reporter named Don Lehman, one of our best reporters, the entire time I was at the newspaper, did a phenomenal job on that as well. But this, even a heart of a tragedy, people want to know, and they want to know what happened, why it happened. Why were these 20 senior citizens, some in wheelchairs, allowed to be crowded onto this boat with only one employee? Turns out they had violated a rule. There's supposed to be at least 2 people. That's important journalism that you have to do and is important to the community.
Sure, sure. And so then you have these other tragedies that you were referencing.
Yeah,
Um,
we had one community, a community of small town, Fort Edward, blue collar town, right near the GE factory, a paper mill, and twice in 10 years they had catastrophic fires in which children died. 4 died, and in this one, from the funeral, 6 died. And again, so often reporters are criticized for covering these kind of stories, being ambulance chasers per se. But in this one story, we had a young reporter again. We always have young reporters. That's the kind of newspaper. That's what newspapers do. They hire young
Sure.
reporters. And he showed up at the scene of the first fire where 4 children had died, and the mother was outside. She had gotten out, and she was standing there with that 1,000-mile stare. And one of our competing reporters went up to her and handed her his business card and walked away. And our reporter didn't think that was right. And he waited a little bit until she was alone. He walked up to her. He told her, I can't imagine what you're going through. This has got to be the most horrific thing in the world. I'm a reporter from the Post-Star. I'm going to be writing a story about this, but I'm not going to know anything about your children unless tell me about them except their names and ages. And that got her talking. And she
Yeah.
talked about what they wanted to do with their lives and what their role was and what their favorite subject were in school. And this humanized this to a level that you don't, that's hard to imagine. And I don't think anybody thought about that. And I didn't even know about what he had said to get her to talk until I interviewed him, 20 years later. And
Wow.
in the second fire, we had a 22-year-old covering her first fatal fire. And she showed up at the scene, and the fireman looks at her and says, I can't say anything on the record. And then he pointed over at this smoldering ruin of a home and said, but there are children in there. And later, they reported that the 6 children, 5 of them were found upstairs bedroom. And the oldest, the 12-year-old, was found draped over the other children, trying to protect them.
Tragic.
It's the kind of humanity that, it's a horrible thing, but in some ways it's important for us even to go on with life, to understand how fleeting it can be, how tragedy could be just around the corner. But what was great about that story? It led to a whole push for everyone in the county to get smoke detectors because the house was found that didn't have enough smoke detectors. Anyone in that county could go and get a free smoke detector, I think, for the next couple of years. And I ended the chapter on the book with 2 years later, a father was awoken late at night to the sound of a smoke detector, led his family out the upstairs window and onto the roof and out of the house. And it was from one of those smoke detectors that had been bought from and the result of that tragedy. So in a way, this tragedy led to saving other lives too.
And
That's journalism. That's the importance of the work.
I'm not sure it would have happened with the local tragedies with the fires, but certainly with the boat that capsized. Did you find that difference? Were people more willing to talk to the local paper compared to a national reporter that may have parachuted in for a day or two? Um, or were
Yeah.
journalists, in general, just painted with the same brush? Um,
Well, again, we were very fortunate. We had a reporter, as I mentioned before, Don Lehman, who did cops, courts, and the county later on. And he had unbelievable sources. When the Ethan Allen sank, he was sitting at home on a Sunday afternoon watching the Philadelphia Eagles. And the sheriff called him and said, you better get up here. I mean, that's the kind of sources that a local newspaper reporter has. And for the next 10 days, you had the CNN trucks, you had the local TV trucks. And I'm happy to report we were always kind of one step ahead of them. In this case, one of the interesting stories that we broke on it was that there had been a similar type boat accident in Baltimore. And we had happened to have a great reporter who had just gone to the Baltimore Sun. And she emailed one of our editors that, they found in that case that the NTSB, the standards for the weight of people on a boat was grossly out of date. They said the average weight of a person was like 140 pounds. Well,
wow.
we all know that
We've all gotten
today's
a
day
little
and age,
bit,
the average weight of a
yeah.
person was not over. Yeah, we've all gotten a little bit healthier, let's say. And they found that the average weight on that boat was more like 180 pounds. So there was like 30-something people on that boat, and there really should have only been like
Wow.
15 or 20. So
Wow.
that ended up changing the rules, around the country. That, and that we were one of the first on that type of reporting.
And Patricia Freudenberg, watching on LinkedIn, says, unfortunately, it takes a tragedy to take precautions for the future, referencing the smoke alarms that you talked about earlier. I want to bring up this image. This is another story that you worked on locally. These are women who came forward with stories of, is it domestic violence? And they're all willing to be willing to tell their story, but also to be photographed.
Yeah, and this has a prelude to it as well. And we had talked about Mr. Mahoney earlier, who would
Yeah.
later go on to win the Pulitzer Prize. Mark was with his three daughters again on a Sunday afternoon, and he stopped at a convenience store in downtown Glens Falls to get some snacks. And Glens Falls is known as Hometown USA. We have a murder every 3 or 4 years. Okay, that gives you kind of some standard now. A car pulls up outside, blocks in another car at the gas pump. A man gets out with a long rifle and shoots a woman to death. It was his estranged wife. And he did this in front of Mark and his three daughters. And, there was many other people in the store as well. It was such a public display of violence that by that Monday morning, we were already convening a meeting in our newsroom to say we have to do something on domestic violence. Nobody would really think that this is a problem in Hometown USA. And we put a little blurb in the newspaper, and we asked our readers would they be interested in telling their story on the record about their experience with domestic violence. And we've got, I think, 23 or 24 people came forward to tell their stories and agreed to do it on the record. And we had one reporter who he was again a guy probably about 25. He's an Australian national. Actually, he's actually a big deal journalist in Australia now, and he was given the assignment to talk to all of the victims. And he told me later on when I interviewed him how he would do his regular shift as a feature writer at the newspaper, go home for dinner, come back at night into the kind of empty confines of a much quieter newsroom. And he would listen to the stories of domestic violence and listen to these women cry.
Wow.
And
wow.
The story, it was a 3-part series that he wrote about it, was just horrific. It was impossible to read. In some ways, we should have never run it over 3 consecutive days because it was so hard to read. So right before we published this story, we realized we had a problem. We didn't have any art. We don't have an artist we can go to give us a fancy, a cartoon of what domestic violence might look like or anything. So somebody in an editorial board meeting said, maybe there's strength in numbers. And we reached out to all the victims, the 20 or something victims, and said, would you be willing, along with some of the other women, to have your photograph taken? And I think 9 or 10 agreed. I think we have 7 or 8 there who did show up for the photo. This is in Crandall Park, right in Glens Falls, Queensbury. And our photographer, again, TJ Hooker, who was at the Ethan Allen, he had a ladder. He got up on top. And I stare at this photo all the time. It is still, I'm looking into the eyes of each of them and what they must have seen, what they have gone through, and what bravery it took to have their picture taken.
Yeah.
And to stand there almost in defiance
Yeah.
of those that had abused them. And it's inspirational, and this is the type of story that unfortunately probably isn't getting done as much anymore.
And Liz says how courageous of them, not just to tell the story, but
Absolutely.
again to be photographed. Absolutely, certainly agree. We're having a discussion with Ken Tingley, retired editor of the Post-Star in Glens Falls, New York. You can follow him on Twitter at Ken Tingley and subscribe to his Substack, kentingley.substack.com. 3 times a week, he puts out interesting columns. One of your most recent columns, Ken, had to do with this documentary called "The Quiet Epidemic" about Lyme disease. I know it's going to be it's at playing at film festivals, and it's going to be at the Adirondack Film Festival later. This is, I would assume, a pretty serious issue up in upstate New York, right?
Yes, absolutely. And you talked about what the retired journalists do, I guess, when they're retired. And one of my I volunteered to be on a committee that was vetting films for a local film festival, the Adirondack Film Festival, which is going to be going on in a couple of weeks. And there was 115 movies I had to watch, and The Quiet Epidemic was one of the first. And what immediately struck me was it featured one of my fellow upstate journalists, a woman named Mary Beth Pfeiffer, who was a star journalist for the Poughkeepsie Journal. Again, another great newspaper. It's done fantastic work over the years about her coverage of Lyme disease and the controversy in the medical community on how to diagnose it, how to treat it, whether chronic Lyme disease is even real. And it immediately resonated with me, this movie, that this was something that everyone in our community and really all over upstate New York needed to see. In just doing casual yard work, I've picked ticks off me myself as well, and had to have them sent out for testing. And you find out, well, the testing isn't very good, so it's not a surprise it comes back empty. But the amazing thing about these directors that put it on, they were two local kids. One was from Salem, New York, which is right over by the Vermont border in upstate New York, and the other was from Tamarack, which is just east of Troy or Albany. And both of them had suffered from Lyme disease and its effects, and were both struggling to get treatment. And this is, I mean, a debilitating condition. And they were at a doctor's office where they were both seeking treatment. And when the nurse heard that Lindsay Keys, who was one of the directors, was a filmmaker, she said the nurse jaw dropped, and she was like, "Well, we have another patient, Winslow Homer Craig, who's also a filmmaker." And she said, "That's really weird." And so Lindsay wanted to she said, "I want to make a documentary about Lyme disease." And she said, "Well, I can't tell you who he is because of HIPAA rules." So the nurse passed a note from Lindsay onto Winslow, and that started their relationship that's been 7 years running now to get this movie made.
Wow.
And they actually started the process here in Queensbury, where Lindsay's mother was living, and they lived in Queensbury for a while as putting together the whole movie. So now it's showing at film festivals around the country. I think anywhere from 15 to 20. I think it's in the Woodstock Film Festival. I'm not sure if that was this weekend or next weekend. Woodstock, Vermont. And the Adirondack Film Festival is coming up, but it's been in others. It was in a very prestigious one in Toronto, where it was honored. It's just one of the big points is that, well, yeah, this all started in Lyme, Connecticut, and it's kind of thought of, but Lyme disease has spread really all over the country. Some of it is the warming of temperatures. Ticks have been allowed to proliferate, year round now. And it's an important movie, especially if you live anywhere near the country or where you're mowing a lawn. That's all it takes.
You can learn more about it at thequietepidemic.com, as Paula shared on Facebook, thequietepidemic.com. Sujana Chandrasekhar, a physician who is a regular viewer of the show, was just talking about the weirdness of Lyme beliefs in the medical community in various geographical areas. So this is something that we definitely need more information on and more conversation about. Our friend Rahadian is watching from Brentwood. Thank you, Rahadian, for joining us. Liz is sharing that Lyme is a big deal in Western Massachusetts, and pets are vulnerable to it as well. And again, as a good researcher, Paula realized it played at the Woodstock Film Festival on Friday of this week. So thank you. And my mom is jumping in. It's providing great public health education around Lyme disease. So thank you for that. And again, hi, Mom, somewhere back here in the living room watching. She's usually in Hastings on Hudson, New York, lower Westchester County, but she is visiting us here in Springfield, Virginia for a few days. So it's always great to have her. So,
Neil, one other thing about the documentary,
sure.
The Adirondack Film Festival, I'm actually going to be the moderator on a panel discussion between Lindsay and Winslow and a microbiologist from SUNY Adirondack named Holly Ahern, where we're going to be talking a lot about, and that is a big issue that's addressed in the movie, is about how it's treated and how the medical community continues to be a little bit divided over how you treat it. Is chronic Lyme a real thing? And thankfully, it's starting to change, but more work needs to be done.
Great, great. So with that, I'd like to switch gears a little, Ken, and we'll take a look at the New York Times. We will pull that up, and we'll walk through the paper. We'll ask you to comment as stories come up. If something catches your attention, please let me know. But we'll go ahead and dig in to the Sunday New York Times. So we'll first open up the front page section. We went over the front page earlier at the beginning of the show. A lot of stories about Ukraine, of course, and Hurricane Ian, a Herschel Walker story in the beginning. One of the things that we always like to pay attention to are pages 2 and 3 of the paper. My favorite is this column on page 2, Inside the Times. And this is an article by Emmett Lindner, a friend of the show, to cover fire, prepare before it starts. So this is an article about how journalists cover, photographers and others cover forest fires. We always like looking at the headline in history at the bottom of the page. A new dollar bill makes its debut. October 2nd, 1957, the apparent big change is the words "In God We Trust" printed on the back, the Times reported. The last change in design to the dollar bill had been in 1935. And the top of the page 3, they always have these noteworthy facts from today's paper to draw people in. Again, this is not available in the online anywhere. In 1964, when Surgeon General Luther Terry announced to the nation that studies had confirmed the link between cigarettes and cancer, he did so on a weekend to minimize the impact on stock prices. We will be talking about that in a little bit. That's in the Sunday business section, how McKinsey got into the business of addiction. There's also a quote of the day at the bottom, and we'll flip that up as well. The election is a demonstration of how voters in a polarized country unify themselves around what they hate instead of what they love. This is a quote about the elections in Brazil. So we will go through the rest of the paper. International section. This is a story: floods aggravate the plight of Pakistan's farm workers. Flooding in Pakistan has been devastating and ongoing for the last several weeks in that part of the world. Lament in arrest of Iran. We are breaking under financial pressure. Shopping in Tehran. Despair stemming from brutal inflation and high unemployment has fueled the recent protests in Iran. We have an article here: checkpoints and barcodes. Living under the rules of zero COVID. This is a testing station on a busy Beijing street. We will keep going here. More international news. This is the continuation of the articles on Ukraine. Russian troops retreat from crucial city as Ukrainians push east. And this is interesting. I haven't seen this before. And this is, we always like to show the ads in the paper. This is from Mass Mutual. Have the tough talks. Draw up your money plan. Nothing helps build a thriving future like a solid financial plan. Why then are we so uncomfortable having money conversations even with the people closest to us. And they get their information across in a series of comic style panels. So, interesting approach to that, to public education. Here is more on Ukraine, and an article about the election in Brazil. And here in the National, in fight against drug deaths, fentanyl test strips prove divisive. And again, another ad, and we like paying attention to the ads. Cuomo is back. You're
That's a
chuckling there,
scary
Ken.
one.
This
That's
got
a
your
scary
attention, huh?
one. It did.
It's
It did. I thought the governor was coming back.
it's his brother. Chris Cuomo returns with an all-new show on America's fastest-growing
Yeah,
cable news
I know,
network,
yeah.
News Nation, which is interesting. And here is the bottom half of that page. I admit I am not familiar with News Nation. If it's but Dan Abrams, Ashley Banfield, interesting folks they're pulling together. This is there's an article about the governor's race in Michigan. Here, this is the a continuation. Members of Congress urgent threats will lead to deadly violence. I don't remember the headline. Lawmakers fearing the worst as intimidation tactics grow. I think I missed that when we first saw that on the front page. Whoops. There we go. We're back. Lawmakers fearing the worst as intimidation tactics grow. And just want to make sure you can still hear me.
Yes.
Let's see here. Getting back inside to the paper.
You know, Neil, the story about the lawmakers.
Yeah, sure.
It's really horrific. When you think about they're spending thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases to protect themselves. But part of me was like, well, isn't this some of your own doing? I talked a little bit about Representative Stefanik earlier. Before one of her elections in 2018, we were trying to kind of fight back against kind of the rhetoric and the ugliness of politics. So our editorial board wrote an editorial that asked her a simple thing: will you agree not to lie in the campaign? Will you agree none of your ads will have lies in them? And her opponent immediately agreed to that, but she never did. And obviously we're seeing this. That's basic playbook, it seems these days, that everything is a lie and worse. And so when you see something like this and there's this lament that how terrible, well, isn't it leading to violence and threats of violence because of their actions? There's never an excuse for violence, obviously, but it starts maybe there.
Absolutely. As we continue on, there's an article about pandemic pets are surrendered in droves as the world reopens. A lot of people got pets during the pandemic, and now they have to go back to work. Inside, let's see. This is a report about the Venezuela prisoner release, also the prisoner swap, rather, from Iran. But this is what I wanted to focus on: the devastation of Hurricane Ian, the worst hit areas of Florida before and after. Some really nice photography and some design before and then a Thursday after. And Sojana Chandrasekhar said she found it weird that her Thursday news alert were 3 stories: Ukraine, Florida devastation, and Trevor Noah leaving the Daily Show. And so that was an interesting trio in terms of a news alert. And here's a continuation of that article as Ian intensified. Yep.
I wondered if, I looked at the photographs and I thought that was what you never see, certainly in television coverage, is the before and after, which you have here. And I wondered if this was drone photography. I'm guessing it is. But, that's something that I maybe regular readers don't think about. but this is one of the ways you can use drones to kind of be in that type of position. So it doesn't say anywhere, but and
They do. They have photo credits on these. One of these is Google Earth. The ones on the before pictures are Google Earth,
are
but
they?
each of the photos have a photo credit. But you're
I mean,
right;
they could
it's
be in
not.
a helicopter. I mean,
Yeah, well, it could be a helicopter or drone, but I think that the idea is that they wouldn't necessarily say what tool was used to take the photograph, what
yeah.
kind of camera. But it would be interesting to have that backstory um, on photos, certainly. Um,
What I found so interesting about this story was, whenever we see these devastating hurricanes, and for those of us that don't regularly experience it, and I maybe have a little more of a personal interest in this now. My son just recently moved to New Orleans, and so we immediately are reading him the riot act on, well, you see a hurricane, you're getting out of there. But that's kind of always the question is, well, why do people stay there so long, and why don't they evacuate in a timely manner? And here this story really explores the why of that happened, especially in Lee County, which the original forecasts were kind of, well, we don't think we're going to take a direct hit, but obviously the forecast changed. And Lee County had the Times reporting is really good here, where they really find at the Times that the Lee County had a plan in place, but they didn't follow the plan. And like, for instance, most of the other counties were putting their evacuation plan in place by Monday morning, but because Lee decided to wait, they had sent all their kids off to school. And one of the places you were evacuating to was the school. So they couldn't evacuate until later that evening. And even then they waited. So what most people found was, by the time they got home from work, they had kind of run out of time to get out and decided to just hunker down. It's a
wow.
really interesting, and I think fundamental thing when you're looking at hurricane coverage. They explained why they didn't evacuate, because you look on TV all the time and say, well, why didn't they leave?
Sure.
Are they just not making bad decisions? Well, some of it is they're getting bad information too.
Sure. This is a continuation of the front page. It's a big story about Herschel Walker. Walker has enclosed racial rift in hometown. And
I thought this was a fascinating story, Neil.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
tell us about it.
well, in 1980, by 1980, you're thinking, I'm old enough that in 1980 I was already working in newspapers. By 1980, you're thinking, well, there really isn't these significant racial issues where there's protests and people. But in Herschel Walker's hometown, this was going on when he was in high school, and he was asked to be one of the people to stand up to the abuse that the white community was kind of heaping on the black community at the time. And he, as a young man, just wasn't ready to do that. And whether it was, he didn't want to put his scholarship in danger, his coach gave him the advice that, well, you have to get in shape for football. You can't be marching. That's not going to get you in shape. And that's the kind of thing, and this issue has come up many, many times about athletes and whether they should get involved in issues, whether it's race or other political issues. And the fact that for them to kind of go in and talk about his hometown, and essentially they found very few people in his hometown were supporting his Senate run for this reason. 42 years later, they're still thinking about it, and don't think kindly to him, even though his family still lives there, and they think highly of his family, but not so much about Herschel.
The issue came up differently
It's a
for
fascinating
Michael
story.
Jordan. It was a different, it was a similar
Exactly.
issue for Michael Jordan. Um, he was in a different point in his career, certainly. But that question of
Yeah.
whether he would be involved
Everybody
in
buys
civil rights
sneakers.
issues. Exactly. Um, we have more. We have an obit section. Yusuf al Qardawi, a Muslim scholar with powerful voice, is dead at 96. I will say that personally, having lived in Egypt for 2 years, my wife got a PhD focusing on political science, doing research in Egypt, and having lived there and having ties to the region, it's nice to see I mean, in a other part of the paper, but an obit about a Muslim cleric, a Muslim scholar that is positive. It's not, uh, not all terrorists. They're not all, people who are out to kill you. And this definitely gives a different look for folks. So I appreciate that. Um, and we have Hector Lopez, a manager who broke the baseball color barrier. Hector Lopez left with Yankees closer Mariano Rivera. Um, at an old timers game. So this is to me a great example of serendipity. One of the things that we like about print, and we celebrate print journalism and looking through the hard copy of the paper, is you find articles you wouldn't have seen otherwise. And I know I did not see this article scrolling. I look at my app on my phone at least 15, 20 times a day. Every time I just look to see is there anything new, what's been updated, etc. And I'll definitely go back and read this obit. Um, we have the sports section, and we don't usually spend time on the sports section in on the read along, but I'm going to make an exception today, and we're going to focus in on one particular story. I'm going to do the New York Times subway fold. You can't see me doing that, but here we go, folding it in quarters. So we can focus on the bottom right corner. Judge stuck on 61, but Yankees win anyway, 8-0. Um, this is one of the things that we wanted to talk about with you, Ken, in terms of Aaron Judge and his pursuit of history. For folks who may not be familiar, may not be um, close baseball fans, Aaron Judge uh, has hit 61 home runs. He tied Roger Maris's record set in 1961, but is not within striking distance of several other notable home run totals. And I'm choosing my words very carefully. Um, Ken, you have some thoughts on the home run totals of Messrs. Barry Bonds, Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa. Um, please share.
Well, once an editor, always an editor. I did want to have issue with maybe the Times headline there. I think Judge hit his 61st home run on was it Wednesday night? Had the
Earlier.
day off Thursday, so he's been stuck on it for 2 games, which I think is a little harsh.
But he's stuck. I mean, we're waiting for him to hit it, right? So
true enough. It seems like we've been waiting a long time. Yeah, as Judge has been approaching this all season, and as a Yankee fan all my life, and really a baseball fan, these numbers have a magical quality. The 61 and 61, Ruth's 714 home runs, and certainly the steroid era, destroyed a lot of that. And when and I hadn't really thought a lot about it, and I didn't really realize that Maris still had the American League record at 61, because you knew that McGwire had come along, and Sammy Sosa and Barry Bonds had just obliterated all those home run records, single season home run records. But now I've come around to the view that no, this is the real home run. And I think a lot of people feel this way, that this is the home run record. And is it time to have an asterisk? You hate to go back to that for those in the steroid era. Is that appropriate that you have to separate that out? And that's a conversation that I think, that there a lot of people are divided in. I think it's a good sign that people like Bonds and Sosa and Roger Clemens and Mark McGwire have not been admitted to the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. And that shows that, a lot of people agree with us on that.
And I completely agree with you. I'm of the same mind with that. I think that it's interesting that Roger Maris, when he hit 161 homers, had an asterisk next to his record for a number of years because Ruth hit his 60 in 156 game season, and Maris, they had expanded the season to 162 games at that point. And he, in reading an article about this, um, Maris up till 1980 felt that he had, his record was somehow tainted.
Yeah.
So he had an asterisk himself for a number of years. It was removed, and now we're talking about putting an asterisk on potentially on Bonds, Sosa, and or Bonds, McGuire, and Sosa in order. But I do want to share. This was an article in the paper that they or in New York Times that they've been updating with Bonds's chase. And what's really great, and I'll make this just a little bit bigger for folks, and appreciate everyone's indulgence. This is a graph of people's various players' home run totals through a certain number of games. They've been updating this as we go. And I love the hide steroid era button. You could hit that button, take out all the steroid, the juiced home runs. If only we could do that in real life and just hide the steroid era, that would be phenomenal. I'm not sure how we'd accomplish that, but if I was king for a day, we certainly would. Um, but definitely wanted to share that, and we certainly have a similar opinion on that issue, so it was worth bringing up. But with the rest of the paper, I do want to make sure as we're approaching the end of the hour, it's already 9:52. So I want to cover a couple of other articles before we let you go, Ken, and before we ask you for a pro tip. First of all, on a personal note, and I'll jump back on camera for just a moment. I believe you celebrated an anniversary this week. Is that correct?
Well, it was earlier. It was September 25th.
September 25th. So just about a week ago. Congratulations on that. Congratulations on that.
Yes, 40 years. 40 years of marriage.
Great. And I want to make sure folks know, in case you joined us late, you can always watch the show on the channels that you're watching on the same links as soon as we're done on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and our Digimentors website. So first of all, congratulations on your anniversary, Ken. And then as far as the rest of the paper, the articles, we had this big section on Asia travel that we won't be able to get to. Have you traveled to Asia, Ken?
I've traveled extensively to Europe, but I've never made it to Asia.
This is a picture from Seoul. We can just flip through this real quickly. Great photography, and hotels, exploration through food. This is Singapore. My sister lived in Singapore for a number of years. I never had a chance to visit. My wife actually went to visit with my mom when Amy was there. This is Thailand and South Korea. India, masala dosa, which is nice. Crepes, effectively, with potatoes and, of course, spices. Japan, soup curry. And then, of course, some ads in the back. This is a dynamic scene in New Delhi. Galleries, bars, and clubs are popping up in 3 neighborhoods on the city's edge, drawing art lovers, fashionistas, and nightlife seekers. Japan without the crowds for now. Interesting. And then more on Thailand. So that's, I wanted to give a quick look at this special section on travel. And then this Sunday business article, we'll get to that in just a moment. How McKinsey got into the business of addiction. Certainly the consulting firm working for decades with big tobacco and then helped Juul. So we will definitely get back to that later. I'll make sure to read that article. Didn't have a chance to get through the rest of the paper today, but we had a fascinating discussion with Ken Tingley. And what I want to do is give Ken a little bit of a break. And Ken, what we'll do is we'll take you offline for off screen for just a moment and ask you to come back with a pro tip for journalists based on your years at the paper, 21 years as editor at the Post-Star in Glens Falls. Um, and Patricia is always already saying thank you uh, for being with us today. Um, so we'll give Ken just a little bit of a break. Again, my name is Neil Parekh. I'm the executive producer and guest host of the show. We want to thank our production team. Of course, you see Sri and myself on camera. You don't see Paula on camera, but you see her on Sri's Facebook and LinkedIn, providing context, links to articles, and really doing a lot of the research during the show. So thank you, Paula, for everything that you do to make this show a success. Another shout out to our sponsor, Muckrack. And a reminder that the show is produced by Digimentors, a consulting firm that Sri started that I joined as VP of Events and Communications. We do want to give a shout out to the Local Connection newsletter, especially with our focus on local news. Very timely. The Center for Cooperative Media at Montclair State University brings you the Local Connection newsletter each week. It offers story ideas and pro tips for journalists. And best of all, it's free. You can subscribe at bit.ly/local news tips, bit.ly/local news tips. With that, I want to bring back Ken Tingley to share a pro tip for journalists. Ken, what would you have to say to journalists?
Well, this one, I guess, is about interviewing, and this probably could go for anyone who has to do interview. It could even be for job interviews or anything like that. I found that when you're asking questions, when you're asking especially difficult questions, often you get a very short response. You get a very response that could be, off the cuff, and that's it. And what I've found over the years is to just shut up and wait and let silence fill the void. And people hate silence. And more often than not, they would give you more and really get more to that. They have a few seconds to think about it and give it more. But the key is when you ask that tough question, when you have to think, is don't be quick to just kind of move on to the next thing. Wait it out. Wait it out. It's a subtle type of interview technique, but I found it can be very effective.
Absolutely. Great advice, Ken. Great advice, Ken. Really appreciate that. Want to share a few comments that came in as we were wrapping up. Deborah Bernick, excellent session. Local papers are vital. And yes, again, we focus on the New York Times, but we are a staunch supporter of local journalism and encourage you to subscribe to your local newspaper. Diana says, thank you for a nice show. Thanks to Ken and the show's production team. Thank you, Diana. Rahadian says we'll catch the replay later. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rahadian. And my mom, excuse me, nice guest with a lot of different local coverage and on various important topics. Thank you, Ken. What I'd like to do before we close, as a point of personal privilege, and we've shared this on the show a few times, and I shared this online over the weekend. My dad was an avid reader of the New York Times, and he passed away 13 years ago yesterday. Was October 1st is the day he passed away. And one of the reasons this show is so important to me personally and why I connect with the Times so closely is that one of his last wishes was to be buried with a copy of the Sunday New York Times in his casket. He was not buried, he was cremated with the Sunday Times. So that's always an important point. We celebrate that. We talk about that on the air every now and then. But on a more pointed note, Ken, what I'd like to share with our viewers, and that's why the story that I was pointing to earlier in the bottom of the business section, and I'm going to put that back up for folks, how Mackenzie got into the tobacco business and into the business of addiction. My father smoked for 50 years. He was started when he was 15. He died at 65. And what I said at his funeral was just a plea for people. If you have family members who smoke, loved ones who smoke, do what you can to support them, to help them quit. Reaching out to the Lung Association and Cancer Society, know that it's a difficult process, but give them the support that you can. It's not meant as a as to attack people who are smokers, but more to support their loved ones in their efforts to help people quit. It was he had a series of uh, heart disease over a number of years. He actually had a heart transplant, but then succumbed to a hospital-based infection about 6 months after his transplant. So I just wanted to share that personal note with folks. And Patricia shares, may my dad's legacy live on forever. Thank you, Patricia. Appreciate that. And I know, Ken, you share that you had a reader send you a similar story, right? Of someone who was buried with a Post-Star.
Yeah, over the years, you take a lot of abuse as a newspaper editor or reporter, a lot of criticism, but ultimately it's the readers who lift you up often. And I remember one time, this was in 2016, and I kept the email. I got a woman who sent me an email, and she said, uh, I love the Post-Star, and my father loved the Post-Star. And before we closed the lid on the casket this week, we put a copy of the Post-Star in there so he could read it on his way to heaven.
Yeah.
How do that's the place that newspapers hold in small communities. And I think that's more often true than not. People would call up and complain about something and say, and by the way, the paper was late. they, they had to have.
Yeah, it means a lot. It means a lot. Whether it's for us, it was the New York Times, and at the time, it was the Herald Statesman in Westchester County, and even the Rivertowns Enterprise, which was the Hastings, Dobbs Ferry, Ardsley newspaper, small river towns where we grew up. But thank you. And Deborah Bernick is sharing that her husband just asked for both the Washington Post and the New York Times for his casket. And Deborah, may that time when he needs that wish fulfilled be many, many years from now. Diana is sharing that her dad kicked the habit after 50 years of smoking, but her brother couldn't, and he died of cancer at age 50. So sorry, Diana. Thank you for sharing that. And yes, cancer sucks, whether it's cancer, heart disease, what have you. It is it's devastating. So really appreciate you sharing that. Uh, Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another edition of Sri's Sunday New York Times Read Along. You can catch the show from the beginning, where Ken is talking about his books, The Last American Editor and The Last American Newspaper, at the top of the show. This is The Last American Editor. This is The Last American Newspaper. With that, thank you very much. Have a great Sunday. We will see you next week. Bye-bye.